John, thank you so much for joining us on Social Impact Power Chats.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited about this.
Amazing. Well, I think I was first kind of aware of you or introduced to you at a conference, I don't know, a decade ago when you were doing a presentation and was immediately just, in awe of your work, as I know everyone who listens to this will be. So if you could just kind of give us your coordinates, tell us a bit about how you got into social impact, that would be phenomenal.
Sure. So I grew up in South Minneapolis, not far from where most folks might associate it with the community where we lost George Floyd. So the South Minneapolis community is where I grew up, and got involved in kind of as a community organizer and a political organizer early in my career. I saw my mom get involved in working on behalf of the homeless in Minneapolis and doing some really good work there as a volunteer. And so for me, I wanted to follow in the quasi family footsteps and do work in community, and it started at the grassroots level, both again starting as an organizer. My family, we lived most of our life in kind of deep poverty and in a community that right before my eyes kind of transferred from a community that, while always poor, was a community that like had this kind of gelling where people looked out for each other, into a community that didn't have that for a variety of kind of challenging factors. And so that's always been kind of part of the way in which I approach the world, is kind of seeing my community shift and being involved with folks at the community level as an organizer, and then as a caseworker and working in direct services on the ground. That would kind of the first phase of my career. And then as I moved from Minneapolis to New York City, went to grad school and started this kind of career where I was kind of advising and consulting and teaching, and became this kind of what they called a pracademic, where I studied the nonprofit sector and what happened on the ground and things like that, and consulted and worked directly with folks that were doing the work. And then I think this third part of my career, as I shifted from there, is now I've been in philanthropy, and I think it's been the perfect place where all of those different segments of my career have kind of come together in this work around trying to have philanthropy do a really great job in a place-based way, and really paying attention to the how we do our work on the ground.
Tell us a little bit about Place Base. You're rooted in Baltimore. Tell us a little bit about T. Rowe, about the foundation, and really the mission.
Yeah, so T Rowe as a company has always been supremely committed to working in community, where we were founded and have been headquartered in Baltimore since 1937. And so when I came from New York City to Baltimore, I actually came during the week of the unrest in 2015. And out of that experience, there were a number of folks that were saying, what should T Rowe do as a result of what we're seeing in community? And what I had known as a community organizer and as someone that had worked on the ground is that there wasn't anybody in West Baltimore or Central West Baltimore saying, I really can't wait for T Rowe to come here and help us solve these problems. But what they needed us to do is be really good listeners, which for us as a firm, we do really well with our clients. And so for us, spending time in the community centers or in churches, or even sometimes in the living room of residents, just kind of listening to what community members had said, what they were really asking for was much different than what you might have heard on TV or what others were seeing who didn't actually know anybody in those communities. And I think for us, that created, out of that experience, we've been very similar to lots of kind of corporate social good entities that practice this kind of confetti style approach of kind of grabbing a lot of really small things in community. And for us, we knew that we wanted to have impact, that wanting to have impact coincided with what we were seeing in the community. And so that, with really paying attention to if we were really listening to community members, they really cared about the way in which we walked into community, not only what was being given, but even more so often is like how we were doing it. And so that created for us an approach to how we did this work, and very specific ways in which we were going to get involved in community life. And we realized our resources are limited, and giving in place is a really good way for us to maximize our resources. But if we are going to be relationship driven, it's really hard to do that in an unplaced way, right? And so for us, because we're rooted in Baltimore, and for us really focusing on neighborhoods in Baltimore in large part, although we're global and we give in a number of different places, a majority of what we do happens in the Baltimore community, and we do our work in neighborhoods throughout Baltimore.
I love that idea that like you can't actually be proximate everywhere, right? Like
Yes,
you can't be proximate in the ether. There has to be like something you can touch and feel. I always try to position some of these questions. You're across the table from somebody having a coffee who's,
yes.
looking to build or looking to, create something that you have experience and expertise in. I'm wondering, this sort of deep listening terminology really gets thrown around. And I think there is such a difference, and you've already described it a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can get a bit more practical with us. Such a difference between like sending a survey and saying we went and found information out from ABZ audience. Like, how do you know as a team when you've gotten it right? Or what are some metrics or things that you think, and maybe metrics is the opposite of what you're looking at. Maybe you're talking about like people and human feelings, but like when you're sitting around the table at the end of the year, the end of the quarter, and saying like that was a win as it relates to community engagement and like really listening to folks, what are you looking for?
Well, I would say a couple of things. It's a really good question. So first of all, the arc of community change is long. And so we tend to not look at changing or being involved in community life in a quarterly way. So for us, like the real key here is building relationship. That's first and foremost. Like there is nothing more important to what we do than to understanding and knowing people by name and community. So just think about your individual relationships, right? So I've been married over 20 years, and I'm still learning that relationship. And it's an awesome relationship, right? And it took me multiple times when I asked my wife to marry me that it didn't happen on the first date. And that's someone who is my wife, right? It's like for us to develop relationships and community around ideas that we are going to change the way in which challenging things are happening in community. You can't do that sitting at this desk at T Row or in a cubicle. You have to develop relationships. So that's the first one, and that takes a long time. And the second part of that is there isn't anybody in any community that's saying, again, as I said earlier, I can't wait for John Brothers to tell us what to do. Communities are smart about what they need to do in their own community. And so listening isn't listening so that I can tell communities what to do. Listening is trying to hear the dreams and ambitions and goals of community, where their North Star is, what their self-determination is. And then for me, understanding what's my place if I'm invited to do that. If I have the supreme luxury of being involved in the evolution of a community because I've been invited in by that community, what an honor. But I don't get that honor just because I have philanthropic capital. I get that power because they know who I am, they believe in who I am, and they trust that I'm there for the right reasons. And so it's not unsimilar behind any relationship you might form. And I think walking into community, the most important thing is that's sacred ground. And if you want to get into the act of change, it's their change, not your change. Like you mentioned this word impact, which I think is it's a word that is tossed around a lot, right? If I always say if it was a drinking game and impact was the word, we would be
We
hammered
slosh.
in like 2 minutes. Yeah, it'd be over, right? And so the point of though of that is that that's a community word. That word belongs to them.
Right.
And it is not my job to walk in and start saying those types of words without truly understanding like what's really important to them in terms of what they want to see. And then what philanthropy does all the time is then starts to put hoops and roadblocks to say, hey, we want you to achieve this impact. Start counting things for us. There are all of those types of things that get in the way of true and authentic relationships. The last thing I'll say is nobody wants community change more than they do, right? I don't want it more than they do. They live it and see it every day. But what I do want is to be in concert with them as they realize their full potential, which I think is such a privileged place to be. And we just have to be able to first and foremost honor that space, realize it's a privilege, and then walk in that path to make sure that you're always honoring that ground that they've allowed you to be in.
Love everything that you just said. I have one other, sort of advice question. I think there are so many people who sit in, corporate foundations or CSR teams who really see the power of community-based engagement and ultimately have some trouble holding that line because there's a member of the board or a member of the C-suite or
Right.
a governor or a something who basically
Right.
says, hey, we actually need confetti.
Right.
Um,
Right.
what would be your best advice to somebody who's trying to hold the line, really understands the critical work of this work, but is getting some pushback and also still has the ability to do some meaningful advocacy? Like, what would be the thing that you would tell them as the pump up speech?
Well, listen, I mean, I think that confetti style of work, there's pluses and minuses to that. But inherently that's part of a corporate model, right?
Right.
Like there's lots of interests, lots of ways in which our employees can get involved, lots of ways in which our money can find itself in the communities, lots of different ways. So you have to acknowledge that that's part of the work, right? But there's also a way to do that, right? So for a good example would be if I'm going to confetti style fund $15,000 grants throughout the countryside. One, I have to acknowledge that that's my business model of giving. But I can't demand out of that impact because that's not what those dollars are made for. Those dollars are made for to say, hey, I have a relationship with you and I'm going to give you resource towards that. But I can't demand in a $15,000 grant $100,000 of impact, right? That's not my job, right? And so you just have to be really clear that if you've decided as a company to make the decision that confetti is your style of giving or serving, that's cool. There's no judgments on that. But you can't be one way and then demand a different type of style on the other side, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's just, for me, really clear. Now, to your question, if an individual is saying, I want to have more impact, I want to be involved in more impact in community, then the discussion is, okay, well, what is the resources and tools that I have at my disposal to be able to try to achieve that? So for us here at T. Rowe Price, we have acknowledged that we are in a city that struggles with infrastructure, and companies have infrastructure in abundance, right? My computer didn't work when we first started the call. I was able to go to my laptop. I have two phones, right? Like we're surrounded with conference rooms. Like we just have infrastructure that at the ground level in local communities, having worked in nonprofits for most of my career, they just don't have. And so how can you use your infrastructure for change? How can you use all the different things that you have as a company? Social connection, right? We do a lot of capacity building. But if you're wanting to have impact, it doesn't only mean philanthropy. It means thinking deeply about all of the tools that you have that could be used for community change, and then creating a platter on how you offer that to community and really working with community and to have them understand, here's your resources and this is how you can be helpful. We have 8,000 community partners over the last several years. 300 of them get a grant. A vast majority of the people that come into contact with us get capacity building and technical assistance services, things like that. Because, Emily, less than 1% of all dollars that nonprofits are able to spend is on professional development.
Yeah.
So can we provide that as a resource, because that's an infrastructure piece that we have. So I think really thinking deeply about all the tools that you have as a company, and then how do you use those tools to help communities to what they're truly asking for.
Brilliant. I co-sign all of it. And absolutely appreciate all of the nuggets that you've given us to think about. I can't believe it. We're already at our last question because power chats
Okay.
move fast. And the last question is really just forward looking. If you had a crystal ball, like what are some things that you see coming down the pike, trends, et cetera, that you're looking toward and learning from?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, the things that we're excited about are a number of different things. I mean, I think we here at T. Rowe have done a lot of work over the last year and thinking about, traditional CSR and philanthropy. Those are often units and segments within companies that don't intersect. And we have ultimately put all of those pieces together into one community investment team that thinks really deeply about how does volunteerism and sponsorship and all these different things. And so it's a relatively new model that we're really excited about. I think in the nonprofit space, we've been pushing on a couple of different areas. One is we've been working on this piece around rethinking governance. We think that governance and boards within the nonprofit sector, there's over 20,000 board meetings every day. And we think the general framework behind how boards and governance works is just kind of broken. And how could we thinking about what we believe is one of the best forms of democracy that this country has to be really truly utilized for the assets that they are. And so for us, those are some of the kind of the deep thinking type of things that we're trying to figure out within the sector. We're big on public-private partnership. We've been doing work for the last couple of years around areas around what we call sugar sharing, which is how can nonprofits partner in truly effective ways. We think collaboration is another one of those drinking words that we say all the time, but we don't necessarily practice very well. And so how can we get nonprofits have a lot of economic power that we leave a vast majority of that power on the table and don't use it for our own organizational effects, but also for the effects of the areas in which we can cumulatively come together. And so we struggle there. And so we have a lot to keep us busy. And we think some of the areas that we're working on are areas that are going to be important for the sector to really, truly get better over the next couple of years. And if we do, a lot of really great outcomes for the sector for sure.
Well, thank you for sharing your sugar with us. We really
Sure.
appreciate the time. And anyone who's looking for incredible place-based work will have a link in the notes to come check out everything that you all are doing at the Rowe Price Foundation. So thank you for all of that
Thank
work
you.
as well.
Thank you, Emily. This has been fun.